Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this special kickoff for the Chatham Conservation Foundation's Earth Week activities. Happy Earth Day. I guess I should start with that. We're really excited to begin our programming with Russ Cohen in this webinar. I think, many of you already know Russ from his incredibly busy schedule of foraging walks and talks. I look at his website and I can't imagine how he keeps up that schedule. Or of course for his really seminal foraging book, Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten. But what he is now engaging in is a new adventure as the Johnny Appleseed for edible native species, and he has been. He's set up a small nursery in Weston, and where he grows and keeps plants that he propagates from seed. And he's collaborating. Why he's a special person to the Conservation Foundation. He's collaborating with a lot of land trusts and school groups and community gardens and agencies and tribal groups in disseminating and planting his seeds from his nursery into appropriate places. So as I said, he really, I think probably for many people here, doesn't need much of an introduction. Just very quickly, I just want to just share a little information on the Chatham Conservation Foundation. This webinar comes at the end of our spring webinar series, and it's part of, as I said before, our Earth Day Arbor Day celebration, which is a whole series of events of guided walks and webinars and lectures and tree sapling giveaways and a big town cleanup. If you're here in Chatham, it's not too late to join in on that. And then there's a keynote forum that's really something of an impromptu, in a sense, town meeting over at Chatham Bars Inn later on this afternoon on the topic of coastal resilience. I'm just going to turn it over to Russ, but very quickly, if you are not familiar with our work, please visit us on ccfinc.org, our website, or follow us on Facebook, sign up for our emails, or volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers, especially in our land stewardship area. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you can please mute yourself during the presentation. Russ will talk, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. If you want to put your questions right into the chat box now while it's fresh in mind, or during the presentation, do that, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. So thank you again for joining us, and I want to welcome Russ to this forum. Thank you, Russ, for joining us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Can everybody see my screen okay? I hope so. Mm-hmm. And let me just hide my bar here so it's not in the way. Hide the floating media controls. There we go. All right, so here we go. I'm going to start my show by talking about an important subject, which is to acknowledge the fact that wherever you're zooming in from this afternoon, we are on indigenous land, the indigenous people that inhabited this area for thousands of years. And this is particularly appropriate to mention in this talk because of the content of the talk, because I'm talking about edible native plants. These are plants who figured out they were edible and when to harvest them and how to harvest them and prepare them. The indigenous people that inhabit this area for thousands of years. So I'm so grateful to them for the knowledge that is passed down to me, and happy to share it with you. In addition to that, there's also the knowledge about how to respect nature and to honor its other functions out there besides just feeding people. And if I were to direct your attention to a particularly great source for that, it's this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which if you haven't read it yet, I can't recommend it more highly. And if you only have time to read just a little bit of it, I'd point you to the Honorable Harvest chapter, which is all about foraging. And Indigenous author Robin Wall-Kimmer has come up with this great list of principles that she suggests you might even want to put on a laminated card and take it with you when you go outside to follow this protocol about how much to take and what not to take and stuff like that. This is particularly important for native plants because native plants often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So I encourage folks, if you're gathering native plants in the wild, to use some forbearance and restraint just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. So on the topic of ecological functions of plants, were this to be a live program, I'd ask for a show of hands, how many of you have not heard of this guy? Pretty much everybody has heard of him on talks I give like this, but I suspect some of you in the audience have not heard of him. So Doug Tallamy is an entomologist, and he made an astute observation that when our cherished migratory songbirds fly in here and they pair up, they build their nests, they lay the eggs hatch, little babies are clamoring for food. What are the parent birds seeking to feed the babies, and where are they finding that food? They're seeking to feed them caterpillars, and the caterpillars are on the native plants and they're not in the non-native plants. And so a bird flying around trying to find food for their babies in an area that's all non-native plants, it's like a food desert to them. So Doug says it's really important to plant native plants. Here's one of his books, Nature's Best Hope, which in his view is everyone, because we all ought to be planting native plants in our yard for their ecological functions to support the food web. So as Doug is getting out there and giving his talks and writing his books, the word is getting out in lots of different organizations at different levels, universities, states, nonprofits are getting into the act and telling people about native plants, how to find them, what they are, and stuff like that. Okay, so this slide is from a show I went to given by a person named Kate Venturini, who's from Rhode Island, and her job at the time was to help folks that live along Narragansett Bay put in native plants to absorb excess nutrients like runoff from parking lots and roads and lawns to help keep them out of the bay and help keep the bay clean. Really important objective. So you'll notice that there's the name of the plant on the left side and then all these columns representing various attributes to the right. Grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade, and so on. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't tell people that. And I said, why not? And she said, we don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife. And I said, okay, that's interesting. You've got blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. Well, that's when I said, you might as well tell them what else is edible. And that's what they do in Rhode Island. They have an edibility column in their list of native plants on their state website. And here's the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too, I think provides an additional powerful reason for people to plant them that might be insufficiently induced to do so just in the pure ecological rationale. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for just a second. In my mind, I imagine husband, wife, living on a good sized lot, some room for plantings, and the wife has heard Doug Tallamy talk, or she's read one of his books, and she says to the husband, it's really important, we got to plant native plants. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. And that's when she can bring him to one of my talks, and perhaps there's a husband like that in the audience today. And then he can learn about native edible plants. I realize it's the what's in it for me angle. It's just an additional reason that might push you over the edge and say, okay, I'm going to plant some native plants because I can eat them too. So I realize it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in natives, but I think it's a good point to, I mean, a lot of native plant catalogs and folks that are promoting them will show you the pretty flowers. And yes, that's nice. A lot of native plants are pretty flowers. There'll be a couple in my show. But there's other attributes too, including edibility that might appeal to people to put them in. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of the show talking about specific native plants, but I have a couple other introductory things to cover first. So first thing is, what is a native plant and where is a native plant? So we can set aside the issue of how to decide what's native or not, leave that for another day, but I'll say that one very authoritative source for the information is the Go Botany section of the Native Plant Trust webpage, which has a page like this for every vascular plant in New England. And so here's the spice bush page, and you see here's a map of New England, and you see the black boundary lines. Those are the county boundaries. You'll see that all the counties are colored in, maybe not Nantucket, but all the other counties are colored in green. In Massachusetts, saying that spice bush is a native plant, to all those counties. So if you want to say, well, not only do I want to plant native plants, but I only want to plant native plants that are deemed to be native to my county, this is a great site to consult. And then another very helpful section of the Native Plant Trust website is their what they call their plant finder, their native plant finder, garden plant finder website. And this is what will help you if you say, okay, I like the idea of planting native plants, but what's going to work in my yard? And that's when you can put in whatever attributes you have into this checklist, and then the computer will spit out whatever plants meet your criteria. So you have a dry site, you have a wet site, you have a, you want tall plants, you want short plants, you have sun, you have shade, whatever your conditions are, you just enter them into this. So I clicked on edible just to see what would pop up. And the computer yielded 80 species. That's pretty good. There's actually over 190 species of plants native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative sample. So then I clicked on sweet fern to see what would pop up. I clicked on that, and here's the sweet fern page with lots of additional info. So really helpful, even if you decide that this is all beyond me and I'm going to need to, invite a professional landscaper to help me do a makeover in my yard if I really want to go, full throttle in native plants. This is a good first step to take just to get you in the ballpark of what might work in your situation. Okay, and even better for Cape Cod is your capecodnativeplants.org website. So everything I said about the Native Plant Trust resources is still good, but you have even something even better. And like I said about the you need to bring in a professional to help you, you can go to the APCC's Eco Landscape Audit Program and have them do the preliminary analysis for you. And that's going to also save you a tremendous amount of guesswork. And you might find out just from that process all you need to know to do the planting native without having to bring anybody else in to advise you. Okay, and then here's a great additional publication that's very useful on Cape to help you go from the conventional landscape to one that has much more native plants in it. All right, so with all that, let's start talking about specific species. Okay, so I'm sure you all recognize these as fiddleheads, and almost all ferns go through this stage in the spring, but that is not enough to know if these fiddleheads are safe to eat or not. This happens to be the ostrich fern. This is the quote-unquote fiddlehead fern, the kind you see for sale in the stores and ending up at the fancy restaurant menus and stuff like that. Now, as far as I know, no one is farming fiddleheads. So if you see a fiddlehead in a produce section or in a restaurant menu, it was gathered from the wild. And that's not inherently bad. I gather plants in the wild all the time. That's okay. It's just the way that it's done sometimes. So here I'm going to talk about using the forbearance and restraint that I mentioned before. So my advice is that if you pick one or two of the curled up parts of the fiddlehead clump and leave the rest grow out, that's a totally sustainable level of harvesting. Because unfortunately what some people do, and I think it's probably the people that are mostly picking to convert the plants to cash and sell them to the grocery stores, the fancy restaurants, is they'll pick every single fiddlehead from a clump, and that's sapping a lot of strength from the rhizome. You can actually kill a fern plant by harvesting it so hard. Okay, so how do you know this is an ostrich fern? Well, first, these fiddleheads are growing in a vase-shaped clump, and then if you cut these stems in cross-section, it forms a U-shape, like a celery stalk cross-section. Wrapping around the fiddlehead part is these papery scales that flake off really easily, like with your fingers. And then, let me go back to indigenous knowledge for just a second. So sometimes there's some wonderful practical information embedded in indigenous language. And I learned this from Nancy Turner, who's an ethnobotanist actually from the Pacific Northwest, but I learned from her that the term the Maliseet tribe, using the Maliseet tribe, their traditional homeland straddles the Maine, New Brunswick border, that their word for the curled up part of the ostrich fern fiddlehead, masos, is the same exact word they use to describe the circling motion a dog makes before it lies down. And when I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, I see the resemblance. And that's what you figure out when you're, living in such close, intimate contact with nature for thousands of years, and you're really paying attention to similarities and patterns in nature. You see resemblances like that. So another source of great wisdom embedded in indigenous language. Okay, so here's the typical habitat you're going to see for ostrich ferns. Now, this is not present to any degree on Cape Cod, which is why you don't find native, natural wild patches of ostrich fern frequently in Cape Cod. There's a little bit of it there. It's where you're going to be in the major river floodplains like the Connecticut, the Housatonic, the Hoosic, the Merrimack. Those are rivers that have conditions like this. But the ostrich fern will grow in most areas if it's relatively damp. Doesn't have to be a wetland, but just not bone dry, and maybe a soil that's not really sandy, but has some organic materials mixed into it. You get ostrich ferns to grow there. Okay, here's the last thing to look for to make sure that you have an ostrich fern. These little guys right here, these are the spore-bearing fronds, the fertile fronds. That's how the plant reproduces itself. And if you cut them in cross section, you'd also see that their little stems form that U shape. All right, so if you've ever bought ostrich ferns at the store and cooked them up and been not particularly impressed with them, you might want to try this cooking method, which is amply demonstrated to me by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads that were growing along the Connecticut River in the town of Northfield, Mass. And she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them, and they were truly exquisite that way. Okay, and here's a yard in Lexington, next town over from me in Arlington, Mass, where somebody just deployed the ostrich ferns in their landscaping. And I don't know this for sure, but I would bet that these homeowners have no clue that this is the edible fiddlehead fern, the ostrich fern. They just like the way it looks. And one nice thing about this fern is if you plant a few plants and it's happy where you planted it, it will spread vegetatively and gradually fill in an area and give you nice foraging opportunity as well as a nice show in your yard. All right, so here is milkweed, and this plant, as you probably know, has an important ecological story that we'll get to in a second. It's also very edible by people. Indigenous peoples ate this one and still eat this one. And it's got at least 4 edible stages in its development, so that's why I call it a procrastinating forager stream food, because the stages happen chronologically in succession, so if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develops. So this is actually edible stage number 3, when the common milkweed, and that's, by the way, the only one that's edible by people, so none of the other milkweeds are edible by people. The common milkweed, when the flower buds are in these tight green cluster. So I suggest that this cooking method for all the milkweed parts you want to eat is get a pot of water boiling on the stove, throw whatever milkweed part is that you're cooking and boil it for 7 minutes. And that's definitely enough cooking, and milkweed will not shrink and get all mushy on you even after all that boiling. So for example, here is a bowl of milkweed flower buds that have been boiled for 7 minutes, and look how well they held up. If anything, they look even nicer than they did when they were attached to the plant. So you could eat these just plain, just like that, as a side dish, or you can incorporate them into this dish right here, which is a recipe from my book, Milkweed Egg Puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole. So that's a good way to use the milkweed flower buds. And even the pods are edible when they're up to 1.25 inches long and they're nice and firm to the touch. You boil them for 7 minutes and the texture and the flavor is very similar to green beans. All right, but there is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us that this, actually all plants in the Asclepias genus, but definitely including the common milkweed, are very important to be out in the landscape. We need the monarchs to be able to find them and lay their eggs on them and have the caterpillars eat on them and so on. So I want to make sure that my foraging for milkweed is being balanced out by planting more in the landscape. So I am actively growing this plant in my nursery. We'll talk about that in a little while. And also, I'll show you what I'm doing in my own yard. But first, let me just suggest to you that you could also help propagate milkweed in the landscape very simply. It's not the right time of year to do this, but in the fall, when these pods get full grown and they're brown and they split open and you see the little parachutey business beginning to show that's attached to the seeds, you can just gather a couple of those pods. And as you're traveling around, you see some good habitat for milkweed that doesn't have any, like the edge of a school ball field, bike path, something like that. Just help release the parachutes and help start a new colony that way. Okay, but this is what I'm doing in my own yard. So that's my house in the background there. I have a different car now. I still have that boat. And here along our driveway, we are growing some high bush blueberries. And the milkweed said, well, we'd like to grow there too. So we said, that's fine. So we let them come in. And then we had to net the blueberries so that we could share them with the birds. Otherwise, the birds would get all of them, and we'd like some too. So we put the net on, but the butterflies are able to lay their eggs through the net. And we know that because one time we found this chrysalis attached to a hinge on our garage door, right next door. And fortunately, it was attached on the hinge because when the door went up and down, the chrysalis just went for a ride up and down for a couple of weeks. And then one morning we went out and the chrysalis was clear because the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. So it's really fun to be able to walk the walk and do native plant planting in your own yard to balance out your foraging. Okay, so this wonderful plant is basswood. This is Tilia americana. Also on the Cape, you might run into Tilia cordata, the little leaf linden, which is a plant from Europe. They're edible the exact way. So in terms of eating them, everything I'm about to say about basswood is equally applicable to the linden. So the leaves, which are just emerging now, are very soft and tender and mild and edible straight into your mouth if you want, or you can do what they do with these in England, where they call these lime trees, is you can make lime sandwiches, which are like the watercress sandwiches on the white bread with the crust cut off, and you just layer the young linden leaves as the filling for the sandwich. Or you can wait until the latter half of June when the plants begin to bloom, and they'll produce these yellowish white flowers with this wonderful lemon honey fragrance. And the flowers make a delicious tea. You can use the flowers fresh or dried, and it's very yummy. It also has two medicinal uses. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So herbalists really love to recommend linden tea to their clients. Okay, so one of the important things we learned from indigenous people is a topic, the modern word for it now is phenology, but it just goes back to the astute observations that indigenous people made of seasonal phenomena that would play a significant role in how they decided to spend their time. And so here we have a Juneberry tree blooming. The other name is shadbush because it's named for the anadromous fish that are running in the rivers at the same time this plant is blooming. So their key to move to the rivers to start catching the fish swimming upstream is to see the shadbush blooming. Now, this is another important thing for them and for us, is because this time when the plant is blooming, it's very visible, because when the fruit is ripe, it's harder to see. So better that you see where these are in the landscape in spring when they start blooming, remember where they are, and then go back and check them when the fruit is ripe, which is in June. And that's what the fruit looks like. And you'll see it looks a lot like blueberries, but it really doesn't taste like blueberries. It tastes like a cross between cherries and almonds, which is not surprising when you hear that Juneberries and cherries and almonds are all related plants in the rose family. All right, now songbirds like these fruits too, but the typical Juneberry plant is about 12 feet tall. And when the fruit is ripe on there, it's covered from top to bottom with fresh fruit. And so the birds can fly up in the upper branches and eat those fruits, and you can harvest some from the lower branches. And usually there's plenty to go around, and you have both have all you need. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a secret that isn't really relevant to me right now because I'm retired, but when I was working, I worked on Causeway Street in downtown Boston. So if you ever find yourself in downtown Boston, near North Station, toward the end of June, early July, you might want to do what I did, which is walk across the North Washington Street Bridge to a park in Charlestown called Paul Revere Park. And DCR has planted over 24 Juneberry plants there. And I was able to go there in my lunch hour and pick at least a quart of fruit on my lunch hour. And the fruit is delicious straight into your mouth, just stuffing your face by your mouth, or you can dry the fruit or you can freeze the fruit. It's good any of those ways. I also propagated plants from the seeds inside this fruit. First, I'm going to show you that Juneberry makes excellent strudel. Okay, now let's pop back out to the plants. Okay, so these seeds are perfectly edible, but if you want to propagate Juneberries, resist the temptation to chew the seeds, spit them out, put them in a little plastic bag and throw them in your fridge. And then you're just going to keep them cool. And that process is called stratification. It's just a fancy word for winter, because most of our native plants have evolved an ability to have their seeds bide their time until the cold weather is over, until they sprout. And that's to avoid sprouting, let's say in November, December, when these teeny little plants are going to get killed off by the harshness of winter. So they just bide their time. But sometimes when you harvest the seed and throw it in your fridge, the seed is precocious. It wakes up early. and then you have to sow it. So once the little roots start poking out of the seeds here, you have to sow it. So find if you don't have a greenhouse or a solar room, you can just find a sunny windowsill and pot them up there, and then and there they start growing. So now so these plants, which are now over 3 feet tall in my nursery, are plants I all grew from seeds I gathered in a public park. So Juneberry is one of those native species that's deployed a lot in landscaping. All right, wild strawberry. I bet everybody in this program today has a place they can drop some wild strawberries, especially if you've got any kind of a lawn or mossy area or some place where the plants aren't tall, that's in the sun. Strawberries love to grow in places like that, and it likes acidic soil, and that's all of Cape Cod. And these fruits are teeny, but they're delectable, and a lot of pollinators visit this flowers, so you're benefiting them too. You can make tea from wild strawberry leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea does taste vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some wild strawberry tea. Now, when I have extra seed, I'll often share it with different groups. So here is a girls' school out in Western Mass in Pittsfield called Miss Hall School that has a greenhouse on campus, and they grow a lot of vegetables like broccoli and tomatoes and stuff like that into the seedling stage. And then they'll have a spring plant sale where homeowners from the area will come and buy their little vegetable starts and get them started in their gardens. So I said, well, why can't you do that with wild strawberries? So I gave them wild strawberry seeds, and you can see they just repurposed a clamshell here, put the growing medium in there, sprinkle the wild seeds I gave them, strawberry seeds in there, and then put it in their greenhouse. And they were able to grow the plants big enough so they were able to sell these seedling plants with their vegetable starts at their annual plant sale. And I understand they sold really well. Okay, violet, dooryard violet is another plant that does exceedingly well in lawns, doesn't mind getting mowed, doesn't mind getting stepped on like the wild strawberry. Violet leaves are edible, at least until the flowers come out. Once the flowers are gone, they're not quite as tasty, but certainly up until the time when the flowers are gone, the leaves are good, raw or cooked. Violet flowers are edible. They're very pretty, so you could use those to decorate other foods you're serving, throw them into a salad, whatever. You can also candy violet flowers and then use them for decorating other things like this black walnut cake. So I have propagated violets from seed in my nursery, but I don't really need to do that because I get so many just in the lawn at my house that I can just dig them up there and then they fill right in. You can never tell that I had done that. So all these plants came out from a short area of my lawn, and then these go off to different sites to get planted. And one of the groups that likes to get violets from me are the folks that plant for pollinator folks, because apparently violet flowers are a good early season food opportunity for some of our at-risk wild bumblebees. All right, so talking about another flower, here is the flowering raspberry, and this is probably the prettiest member of the Rubus genus that grows around here, that's native to here. These flowers, these bright magenta flowers, are 2 inches across, so they're quite showy. And then these leaves, these maple-like leaves, are enormous, so that's cool. And then this plant doesn't have thorns. So this is a plant you might consider planting in your yard, even if you never ate it, just to look at it. And this is what the fruit looks like. So I will admit that a regular red raspberry is probably a tastier fruit than these are, just because these fruits are a little on the dry side, but the flavor is perfectly fine. Here's black raspberry, and I don't need to tell you what to do with a ripe black raspberry. I'm sure you can figure that out on your own. But once again, I want to talk to you about something going on in the off season, and that's these canes. These canes turn purple color in the off season. So if this is a plant where you say, well, what could I grow that might even be worth looking at in the wintertime? That might be a black raspberry, because this really stands out, even on Cape Cod where it doesn't snow very much in the wintertime. Even just against the drab brown foliage in the back, the purple really shows up. So, and once again, if you're just, walking around the neighborhood and you see thorny purple canes and, it's February, you're walking your dog or whatever, remember where that spot is and go back and get the fruit in late June, early July when it's going to be ripe. Okay, so here's the common elder. This is the kind I see on the Cape. And some people will gather these flowers and make a drink from them. There's an alcoholic version, there's a non-alcoholic version. And some people will fry these flowers in fritter batter, but I think another species that isn't in my show today because it's not deemed to be native in Cape Cod and it's actually deemed to be an invasive species, black locust. black locust flowers make an excellent fritter, much tastier than these elderberry flowers. And the other problem with picking elderberry flowers off the plant is that you don't get any fruit. Any place you pick a flower off the plant, no fruit's going to grow there. So I typically wait until the plants have their fruit on them. And I'm going to, as you know, the session's being recorded. So what I'm going to do is just go through the next slides really quickly, and you can look at them in more detail later on if you review the recording. And that's true for all my admittedly text-heavy slides that I had up at the beginning of the walk. Okay, and this just tells you about that. This cordial's made from elderberry, and here is a bug called the elderberry borer beetle that relies on elderberries for most of its life cycle. So the adults mate on the elderberry plant, the females lay their eggs in the elderberry plant, the larvae live inside the elderberry plant, so they don't harm the elderberry at all. So yes, that's why it's important to use forbearance and restraint gathering plants in the wild to make sure that we're not harming the other critters that are reliant upon these plants. And this is what elderberries look like if you don't pick the flowers and let them on the plant and they mature into the berries. And this photo isn't upside down. That's what the berries do from the weight of the fruit, hang upside down like that. And I understand you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you dry them first or cook them first, you can eat all you want. And I like to mix elderberries and apples together. So elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie is more interesting than just plain applesauce or apple pie. So here is one of the showiest flowers we have, native flowers in northeastern US. This is the swamp rose mallow. I've seen it grow wild on the Cape. One of the places I've seen it is Long Pasture in Barnstable, for example, growing actually quite close to the ocean near the Phragmites. And this is one of the beautiful things about this plant is if you have a patch of Phragmites growing in your property, you could plant the rose mallow. And once it gets established, it will just thumb its nose to the Phragmites. I mean, it's not going to replace the Phragmites, but it will hold its ground and produce this, so it diversifies your stand beyond just a pure invasive species. So these flowers about 6 inches across. So what I can't tell you in this Zoom program this afternoon is all the different culinary uses for this plant, because I haven't done that much with it yet. I've eaten the flowers raw. They have kind of a mucilaginous, almost like an oniony texture, sort of like daylily flowers, if you've ever eaten them. But I suspect, I haven't done this myself, but I suspect that you can make marshmallows from this plant, because marshmallows have that weird name because they used to be made from a plant called the marshmallow that's actually a European species. But I think you could probably make it from this one. So here's one of our native mints. This is the wild bergamot, and this has an oregano-like flavor. So you could plant it instead of oregano, and it would be very good for the pollinators. So this is one where the flower structure of these plants is such that you have to be have an organism with a long tongue to access the goodies in the flowers. So that's going to be your wild bumblebees and your hummingbirds. And then here's a mint with a much more traditional mint type flavor that you might make a tea from. So this is the broadleaf mountain mint. And if you are looking for something to bring in, if you're starting to get into insects, because, folks that plant for pollinators are paying attention to the insects that visit the flowers. And I'd have to say that of all the things I'm growing in my nursery, this one attracts more insects to visit the flowers than anything else, like this great blue wasp is visiting the broadleaf mountain mint flowers. Okay, bayberry, you might say to yourself, oh, bayberry is all over the Cape. I don't need to plant that in my yard. And I would be totally supportive if that's where you came down. But it's a nice landscape plant and has no trouble growing in Cape Cod's nutrient-poor soil because of its ability to make its own nitrogen fertilizer. The same is true with sweet fern. Now, sweet fern and bayberry don't produce showy flowers. So if that's your thing and you want to, have a splash of color, you're not going to get it from these plants. But if you're looking for plants with strong, fun aromas, both these species count. So this is one of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. So and same thing for this one, sweet goldenrod. And this one has a licorice flavor. Oh, goldenrod with a licorice flavor. Isn't that fun? And the leaves have it and the flowers have it even more. So the flowers bloom in the latter half of the summer. And I've seen this growing in various places in the Cape. One place for sure I can tell you where it's growing is Crow's Pasture in Dennis. So if you're driving on the sandy dirt roads to get head north, head toward the beach, you will see the sweet goldenrod going right along that woods road. And I've grown sweet goldenrod from seed. It's exceedingly easy. Spicebush, another plant the colonists turned to make tea from. They would just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes. Now, I like to gather these berries to eat them and make a savory spice from them, which you do by drying. So you pick the berries off the plant and then you dry them, and once they're thoroughly dry, you can store them in a glass jar in your pantry, and they'll stay for years without going rancid. And then when you want to use them, you just grind a few up in mortar and pestle and make a savory spice. Now, having said that, these berries are high in lipids, and the songbirds know that, so they'll seek to eat these berries as they're getting ready to fatten up and fly south on their long southward migration. So if you're ever gathering spicebush berries in the wild, make sure you leave a lot on the plant so the birds get all they need that way. And if you want to propagate spicebush berries, plants from the berries, do not let them dry out or they'll lose the viability. So you can allow the red flesh to rot off, then take these seeds and sow them. And you'll see that I put this hardware cloth over this flat of spicebush plants, which I'm doing for most of the sowing I'm doing in my nursery, because I'm finding the ravenous rodents dig these up, even if they're not actually anything like, sweet goldenrod seeds are so teeny, they're not any food for a squirrel or a chipmunk, but if you plant them in bare ground, it's like a kid in a sandbox. They'll just dig it all up out of curiosity. Another reason you might want to plant spicebush or sassafras is this cool critter called the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So after this egg hatches and it's about half an inch long, caterpillar looks like bird poop. That's an effective disguise. Then when they get to be about an inch and a half long, these are fake eye patches up here. The real eyes are down here, and the caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake, so that works. And then at the pupa stage, it looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing how this organism has evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? So here is the starry false salmon seal, and this one is a showier version of a more common plant, false salmon seal. So if I were to choose between one or the other in my yard to plant, I might be tempted to plant this one because the flowers are bigger and the berries are bigger, and they do two cool visual things. When they're immature, they have these red stripes on them, so that each little berry almost looks like a little hot crust bun. And then when they fully ripen, they turn this beautiful maroon color. And that's the edible part of this plant, the berries. But you see how I say in moderation, because I understand that if you eat a lot of these berries, like a big handful of them, you might find the other name, which is scoot berries, because you might have to scoot for the nearest bathroom if you eat too many of them. It's never happened to me, but I will just tip you off about that. So there are no poisonous viburnums that not all produce edible fruit, but there are several that do, including nannyberry and wild raisin. Those are two I'm actively propagating in my nursery. Now, I hope you all know this is not poison sumac. Poison sumac berries look like that, loose, drooping clusters of white berries. So any sumac with these upright clusters of red berries is not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. So staghorn sumac, which is what this one is, and smooth sumac and wing sumac all have fruits that are tight, upright clusters of red fruits. So you make a drink from them, and it's very easy. You just throw the ripe seed heads into a bowl of water, rub it for a while, all the flavor comes into the liquid, turns this pinkish orange color, fish the berries out, you're done with them. Take the liquid, pour it through any kind of a paper towel or filter, and then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. I typically drink it cold and sweetened, like pink lemonade. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. And so there's the drink. So all this text is just telling you that you might not want to throw the spent sumac seeds in your compost pile unless you want to be picking out baby sumac plants for at least a decade after you make that mistake. I'm still doing it. It was more than 10 years ago when I made that mistake. Now, for me, it's not such a big deal because I'll just pot up the plants and move them to my nursery and then plant them out in other sites. Sumac is an underappreciated fall foliage plant. Okay, so were this to be a live program, I'd ask everybody, what is this plant? And I have given talks on the Cape where people didn't know. And I had to give them this big hint. I said, okay, look, here is a boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? And then somebody will say, oh yeah, isn't that beach plum? And that is correct. This might be the most important piece of information I'm going to give you the entire show. The best way to look for beach plums is to know where they are in the landscape, is to not look when the fruit is ripe, because they're really hard to see then. Look for them in May when the plants are blooming and they look just like this. Remember those spots and then go back to get the fruit when it's ripe around Labor Day weekend, because it'll look like this. There is a yellow version I'll show you in just a second, but mostly it's going to be this purple color that's a hard color to see at a distance. Now, this is not relevant to the talk I'm giving to today, but I tell people when I give a talk about native plants inland, I include beach plums in my talk because you can grow this plant inland. It does not need to be near the ocean. And beach plum jam is something I make every year. And then once you have the jam, you can make other things like these delicious rugelach. And there is this orangey yellow version of beach plum that's actually it's a subspecies of the purple one. And I'm trying to, I save all the pits from beach plums from all the fruits I pick, and I grow plants from them. And so I am growing some plants from the pits inside these orange fruits, and hopefully I'll get orange fruited beach plums. I think I will. So here are wild grapes, and you might say, I don't want to grow wild grapes in my yard. They're really rambunctious, and I would agree they're rambunctious. But if you have the space, or if you have like a fence, you could train these on, even like a chain link fence. That could be an excellent way to cover up the fence and get some good use out of it. So you often find this particular species of grape by smelling them before you see them, and then you follow your nose to the vine, find the ripe grapes, and stuff your face right to the vine, which is a lot of fun. And in a typical season, you can easily fill up baskets like this and make yummy things like grape cheesecake. Now, here's the other species I've seen on the Cape, the Riverside grape, and this one produces grape fruits too, but they're smaller and kind of muskier than the fox grape, not quite as yummy straight into your mouth. But some people say this is the best species for making the stuffed grape leaves recipes, which you don't gather the leaves when the grapes are ripe. You gather them in the spring or the very early summer when the leaves are fully grown, but nice and young and tender. And so there you go, stuffed grape leaves that you can make for company and say, yeah, these are wild leaves we picked and stuffed ourselves. Hazelnuts, there's two different kinds that grow in the Cape. There's the common hazelnut, the beaked hazelnut. And looking here in the lower right-hand corner, there's your familiar looking nut. Now, the wild ones are much smaller than the conventional filberts you could buy at the store, and they have the same flavor. So you might say to yourself, I think I'll just go to the store and buy hazelnuts, and that's perfectly fine. But I've picked many, many hundreds of hazelnuts in Massachusetts. And so here's the other kind, the beaked hazelnut, where the nut is developing in there. And then you have this strange little thing sticking out like a bird beak here. And all this text is just telling you, don't let nuts dry out if you want to propagate them from a plant from a nut, because they'll lose their viability. Drying them out to eating them is a good idea, but not drying them out to grow more plants from them. And I collect them under power lines, and I realize this might be hard to do on the Cape because the Eversource company is a little extreme with the way they clear vegetation under their lines. But in other areas of the state, it's one of my favorite places to gather lines because they're getting lots of sun, and it's a scary place for a squirrel chipmunk to be. So I find my share of nuts there too. And all oak trees produce acorns, and all acorns are edible. It's just some are tastier than others. It's the level of tannic acid that affects that. And yes, you can propagate acorns from the nuts, but it's a challenge with white oak acorns because they start sprouting very soon after they hit the ground. So you really have to sow them right away. I made an attempt to store them in my stratification fridge, and the radicals just rotted away. So that doesn't work. Shagbark hickory, my #1 favorite edible species. And Pauca hickory is where hickory comes from. It's the indigenous beverage. It's like a porridge that's really yummy. And so I'm collecting many baskets of these in typical season. Now, shagbark hickories are not common in the Cape, so all the more reason to plant more and get more shagbark hickories out there. It's going to take 20 years, though, from planting a tree grown from a nut to when that tree is big enough to start producing nuts on its own. That does not deter me in the least from actively planting these in my nursery and planting them out on my sites. So there's a maple hickory nut pie. I just made one of these last week, and they're really yummy. And it's the New England version of a pecan pie. The recipe's in my book. Here's several different cookies I make when I do a live program. I always bring some kind of wild edible goodie made from native species to share with people. Sometimes I bring these cookies. I'm growing shagbark hickories from the nuts, and here you see them. You pull them out of the stratification fridge, they start sprouting, then you sow them. And once again, you see me deploying this hardware cloth to keep the ravenous rodents from digging up the nuts. And what I say to myself is, if they only knew what I was doing, how their progeny would benefit from all these additional nut trees in the landscape. Oh, but no, they're thinking short term, and we humans, we can relate to that because we often think short term too. Black walnuts, there are a lot of black walnut trees on the Cape. That's what the nuts look like once they hit the ground. You have to get the gunk off them in order to prepare them for eating. It's probably not necessary to sow them, but I end up doing that anyway. Once again, if you want to grow a black walnut tree from black walnut, do not let it dry out. If you want to eat the black walnut, do let it dry out. Here's the device I use to get them open. And then here are two delicious dishes that I make from black walnut. And sorry that we're not meeting in person because I can't feed you this stuff. Okay, here's a bunch of other trees that have edible parts to them, edible fruits, edible nuts. I'll just talk about tupelo, which produces these small dark blue berries that are very sour, but make an excellent jam. And this is a gorgeous fall foliage plant, definitely worth planting, even if you never ate it, just to look at it. And yeah, there are a lot of tupelos on the Cape already, but you might want to plant something that's different, not as common. And tupelo is a plant where I gather the seed and it will start sprouting in stratification. Then you have to sow it. And I have many tupelos in my nursery I grew just this way. Okay, and were this to be a live program, I'd say, what is this plant? And hopefully some of you be able to recognize it just from the flowers as cranberry, which used to be called craneberry because of the shape of the flowers. Now, if I had thrown this photo up, you would have known what it is. Here's a high bush cranberry. There's actually a species of viburnum that is not related to the bog cranberry at all, but the fruits have the same flavor. You can also grow them from seed. And here's one growing outside the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Museum where I gathered some of the fruit and I grew plants from that fruit and I gave the plants back to the tribe. Here's groundnut, which has an edible tuber, and you can propagate the plant from the tubers or the beans, either way. And those tubers are available year round. Drusen artichoke is native to the Midwest, but it was all over the Northeast when the first Europeans came to this area because our indigenous tribes traded for it. As we had quahog shells or other things that appealed to the Midwestern tribes, and we got Drusen artichoke tubers in return. And it's very likely that some places where Drusen artichokes are growing are places, patches that were originally established or descended from patches established by Native Americans. And that's what the tubers look like. All right, so with my 10 minutes left before question time, I'm just going to tell you what I'm doing with all these plants I'm growing in my nursery. So yeah, since I retired from my day job with the Mass Fish and Game Department in 2015, I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species. I've set up this nursery outside of Boston where I'm propagating over 1,000 plants. Where I was earlier today, where I'm going to go back again as soon as I'm done with this talk. And then I work out arrangements with lots of different groups, cities and towns, state and federal agencies, land trusts, indigenous groups, and others to plant plants from my nursery in appropriate places in their properties. And I've done about 30 projects so far. So here's a compilation I put together of the native species, most of the native species in the Northeast that are edible by people. And if you have any trouble tracking this list down, let me know, and I'm happy to point you to it. Here's my stratification fridge. It was a little bit better organized now than it was when I took this photo, but so that's where I store all my seed, the seed that needs to be refrigerated in order to break the dormancy. And so I typically do most of my sowing outside, though, because these are native plants. They don't used to be pampered or coddled and grown in a greenhouse. They're happy, to grow the way that nature does it, with a hardware cloth to protect them from the ravenous rodents. And covering them with leaves is turning out to be increasingly necessary to insulate the plants because we used to be able to count on that. A good layer of snow that would just persist through the entire winter, be an excellent blanket. But no, that doesn't happen very much anymore. So, and my mother has a solar room where I will start some of my precocious seeds when things sprout on me during the winter time. And here's some shots of my nursery where some of my plants are growing. And you don't have to look through this list. This is just a few of the sites where I've done planting. So I'll cover these quickly. So here is an island called Crown and Shield Island, otherwise known as Brown's Island, that's off the coast of Marblehead, owned by the trustees of reservations. And it's a place I've led wild edibles walks for many years. And I asked the trustees, I said, I noticed there weren't any beach plums out there. And I asked the trustees, could I plant some beach plums? And they said, sure. So I went out there, identified sites I thought would be good for planting beach plums, dug the holes, and then I invited some volunteers to help me get the plants across the mudflat at low tide and plant the plants in the holes I had dug. And so this is one of my early projects. And so I'd be misleading you if I said every single plant we put in, they're all thriving. No, some of them died because I made some rookie mistakes. Some of the plants I probably put too close to the salt water and they just didn't like how salty the groundwater was. So, but at least 6 of them are doing really well out there, which is very gratifying to know. Then another island off the coast of Massachusetts where I've done planting is called Baker's Island. This is off the coast of Salem, Mass. 10 acres of the island is owned by the Essex National Heritage Area, and I've done planting there. It's a place where I do an annual wild edibles day where I talk about all the edible plants that were already out there, like sumac and juneberry were already out there, and then there's a whole bunch of native species that weren't there, at least not now. They probably were original inhabitants on those islands. Plants like sassafras that I was able to reintroduce there that are thriving. All right, so here's a municipal project. This is Willard's Woods in park in Lexington, Mass, where they had a pipe in a park that collapsed, and they were trying to figure out what to do, and they decided they just yank the pipe out and daylight the stream. And then they had this area that was disturbed by the work, and so they asked me what native edible plants would do well there. So I gave them a suggestion. And so the town organized some volunteers, brought their consultant in, got some plants from their consultant supplier, and then I brought plants from my nursery. They weren't able to get that way. We put them in, and some of these plants are doing really well in this site years later, including this one, the flowering raspberry, where I saw a spot in the landscape where I said, you know, I see flowering raspberry growing in places like this. I bet if I drop one in, it would do well. And this plant is thriving. And I feel like I can read this plant's mind. And the plant is sending me this message. And the message is, Russ, thank you so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. All right, here's one of my more recent projects. This is the Miyawaki Forest project in Dennehy Park, former landfill in Cambridge, where we brought many hundreds of plants and got a whole bunch of volunteers to put these plants in. And so that includes me with some of my plants. I helped out. And there's a view from the air. So this is much more filled in now. This is after they just went in. So some of these plants are now 12 feet tall already. And so here is a book that I recommend if this is a subject that you are now intrigued by the short little talk I'm giving today, and you want to delve a little deeper. Here's the book I'd recommend for you by Jared Rosenbaum, who's a native plant grower actually in New Jersey, but a lot of the plants that he talks about in this book are plants that are worthy of consideration for Cape Cod landscapes. So I hope you will do that. And that's the end of my talk. And I did refer to this book a couple times, and were this to be a live program, I usually bring a box of books and sell them to people in person. And actually, for my talk so far this spring, I haven't been doing that because we're almost out of books. So we're about to get it reprinted for the 9th time. And this time, we're finally going to put a land acknowledgement in it, which we've never done. And there's going to be a personal statement from me doing more than the book originally did to share what I've learned from Indigenous people in terms of what plants are edible and how to plant respectfully and how to forage respectfully and stuff like that. So with that, I'm done with my talk and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Russ. This is fantastic. And as Russ mentioned, this is being recorded. They will probably not go up onto our website. We're in the process of redoing our website right now. So it will probably be going up in about a month or so. But, just stay tuned and we can certainly reach out to everybody who attended at that point when we get the website up and we have this talk up there at that point. So I just want to open the floor to questions.
I often